All right, so ani bojo tantekiwao mishindengwe ankwat kwendejnakas pakjahan tendonjuba umamawe nene nishnabe kingindonji makwando dam. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Fayant, and as mentioned, I'm originally from Fishing Lake Métis Settlement in Alberta, and I now live in Ottawa. Ottawa is like my second home, and I grew up there in my teens and into my 20s, and that's where I found a really amazing community. And so it's really important to me that even though working with like federal ministers or different high-level initiatives, that I always have my feet planted on the ground. And I've witnessed a lot of times that people forget where their roots are, and they get caught up in high-level initiatives, and I think that can cause a lot of problems for that person and their well-being, but also the work that they're doing. So, for example, I always talk about policy work and how important it is that the people making policies or legislation are the people that know what it's like to live in those policies and legislation, and will be the ones that benefit from it. Because as Indigenous people, how many times have we had legislation passed or policies created or government programs created for us, and they did nothing but hurt us? So I'll get into our roadmap, and so I also wanted to just explain the work that we did and why we decided to work on TRC 66. The government never asked us to work on TRC 66. This was something that we told the government that we were going to do. We were very firm about it. We did not want to create a youth council. So that was originally the ask that came to us, is to create a youth council in terms of reference. And we said no. A lot of us have been on youth councils, or we've witnessed youth councils in action, and a lot of the times, especially in a federal government or Indigenous Northern Affairs ministry, I could just imagine what a youth council would look like and how tokenized it would become. So we said we would not do that, but we would focus on TRC Call to Action 66. And I'll read out TRC Call to Action 66 in a little bit, and I'll read it out several times just to keep it really hot on your memory. But I want to acknowledge the reason why we did this work and why this work was so important to us. And so this is actually something that we put into the roadmap. So we would like to recognize and honor all of the generations of Indigenous youth who have come before us, and especially those who, under extreme duress in the residential school system, did what they could to preserve their language and culture. The voices of Indigenous youth captured throughout this roadmap echo generations of Indigenous youth before that have spoken out similarly in hopes of a better future for our peoples. Change has not happened. We offer this roadmap once again, clearly and explicitly show that Indigenous youth are the experts of their own lives, capable of voicing our concerns, understanding our needs, and leading change. So that was really important to us, because in the roadmap, I'll show you that we actually did a scan of literature. And, the concerns that you hear from Indigenous youth today, these are not new things. These are concerns that Indigenous youth for generations, probably going back right into the Royal Proclamation, have voiced their concerns about. So we wanted to let everybody know that what we were sharing is not new. This is not new information. So I'll go into my slides now. Let's see if I could work this. Okay. So these are some quotes that some of the youth shared with us. What does this one say? Oh, could I brighten it somehow? No. Here, I'll read it off my phone. Okay, so we also we don't add a lot of names to the quotes just because some youth, the things that they shared with us were in confidence, or they felt scared to put their name beside it because of maybe outlash that they would receive. I would say right now a lot of Indigenous peoples and our services are kind of in this awkward phase where you can't bite the hand that feeds, but you also have to tell the government how you feel about things. So it's like this really awkward phase that we're in, and so people are often scared to speak out because they'll lose program dollars or services. So this young person shared with us, we have the weight of the traumas of the generations that came before us. We are a bridge generation to open the door for the ones that are coming so that they don't have to struggle to survive by fighting. They can grow up with their culture and choose who they want to be without this fight. Another young person shared with us, take a person who's hurting and having rough times and put them on the land. Fishing, camping, workshop, weekend, days, hours, weeks, and they will come back lighter. Maybe not perfect, but lighter. The land heals. The water is healing. The winds heal. The nuna, which in Inuktitut is land, will take care of us if we take care of it. The last quote that I'll share with you, just to get us started, was actually by a survey respondent, and we were really surprised by the amount of young people that took our survey. So over 500 young people, Indigenous youth, decided to trust us and fill out these surveys. A lot of the data that we collected was qualitative and not quantitative. So we didn't have like a lot of yes and no questions. We had a lot of open-ended questions. And YouthREX really supported us in this. And I know that it was very challenging for them to try to get data and like hard numbers out of the qualitative responses, but they really took the time to do that, and I really, really appreciate all the hard work that YouthREX put into this roadmap. It turned out in a really beautiful way, and this roadmap is very personal to me. So this last quote that I'll share with you is, we plead for protection, assistance, safety, and opportunities. We are ignored. The government won't listen to us as equals and don't treat us as equals. Reconciliation may occur only after the land is returned to us, after the treaties are finally respected, after we are treated as humans. So now, I'll go into a little bit of the context, and like I mentioned, I'll repeat TRC call to action several times. So call to action was the one we specifically worked on, and it reads, we call upon the federal government to establish multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information of best practices. So right now, there's actually no Indigenous youth funding out there. There's a few like little pockets here and there. They're usually like one-off, like send in an application and get $100 for your community, like things that are so unsustainable. And through this work, I've been able to work in witness several of the youth programming that exists in different departments. Because we wanted this roadmap to be interdepartmental. We don't want it to just be the responsibility of INAC or any of the other Indigenous ministries that we now have or departments we now have. We wanted it to be respected by all branches and ministries and departments. So in that work, I've witnessed a lot of like quote unquote youth programming. Some of these youth programmings have substreams for reconciliation. So again, our needs are always off to the side. They're never at the forefront. They're always in some kind of substream or alternative category. And on top of that, a lot of these programs are labeled reconciliation. And literally, the only reason they're called reconciliation is because it involves non-Indigenous youth and Indigenous youth working together. It has no references to any of the calls to action. And this is so disrespectful. This is so disrespectful to all of the survivors and all of the people that put so much hard work into the TRC calls to action. Like literally, someone could apply for funds to bring a group of non-Indigenous youth to a powwow and then reconciliation. There's no like substantial work. There's no substantial programs being developed and that are led by Indigenous youth on top of that. So as I go through it, just remember this call to action and how important it is. So Indigenous Youth Voices, this is like a really great way to capture the work that we did. An opportunity for Indigenous youth to create a movement and build a collective foundation on which to advocate for our rights, well-being, and people on our own terms. So now I will get into our approach. So our main research question was, how can we advance TRC Call to Action 66 in establishing multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations, bless you, to deliver reconciliation programs and establish national network to share information and best practices? Our research approach guidelines. One, it was holistic Indigenous knowledge systems. So a lot of before we started this work, one of our mentors along the way was Cindy Blackstock. And what she shared with us is, before you start doing this work, create a set of values. Create a set of values that you will live by, that will always be a part of your work. And so, of course, that 100% involved holistic Indigenous knowledge systems. We talked about language a lot. We talked about ceremonies. Through a lot of the work that we did, we would often start with ceremony, and we'd also end with ceremony. This is something that might be new to a lot of folks in research or data collection. I think it's something that Indigenous people bring to that type of work that is really beautiful. And sometimes it can feel like it slows down the work a little bit, but it actually makes the work so much more enriched and purposeful. So we also had, one of our other approaches was reciprocity, and relationship building between researcher and participant. So the way that I would explain this is that we went to go visit many youth across the country. We took the time to meet with them in person. And for us, this is a huge responsibility because they gave us their information and their stories, and they trusted us with it. Some of them shared with us that they were scared that this information would just become another report or another data collection or survey, and nothing would come of it. But we'll keep pushing on this roadmap because they put that trust in us. And then the other approach was collectivity as a way of knowing. So the way that I would speak to this is a lot of the things that we heard, it was not the first time that we heard them. And even though individual stories were very similar, each story was so important and valued on its own. So we didn't want to just be collecting stories and stories and stories, but we wanted to value each and every person that walked with us along this journey. So we had a multi-method data collection. Many of us know how impersonal surveys can be. And so even though we wanted to use surveys as a method of data collection, we also wanted to make sure that there was many other ways to collect data. We wanted to take the time to listen to people, to visit with people. We also acknowledge that some communities don't have access to internet the same way we have access to internet here in Toronto, for example. Some youth actually could only fill out surveys by using a fax machine. We had to do radio, we had to make radio blurbs, and then we also had to set up a 1-800 number so that people could listen to that radio announcement and then call our 1-800 number. And then there would be someone on the other end who would fill out the survey with them. So that's how much effort we put into ensuring that these surveys weren't so impersonal. We also had meetings. Like I said, we traveled across the country. So for me, it was really important for us to go and talk with some of the youth from the Métis settlement in Alberta. And so I brought our team with us. And the Métis Settlements General Council really appreciated our time and effort to be there. And they actually put it in their minutes that we were there to visit with the youth, and they gave us full access to the youth in their communities, and it was a fun time, even though we were there talking about not so great stuff like lack of programming and safe spaces and high suicide rates and gang violence. The youth still brought their jokes and their stories, and there was a lot of talk about mythical creatures called goatmen, and and if you come from the settlements, you'd know what I'm talking about. But when I remember one of the respondents, in one of the questions we had on the survey, it said, "What makes you feel safe in your community?" And one of those young people wrote "Goatman," and it's really funny, but also it's a reflection that a lot of these young people don't have safe spaces in their community. So that's what that told me. Another way we collected data was from a national youth gathering. So we had a national youth gathering at the beginning of December last year. And we invited young leaders. Some were leaders of organizations, of large organizations, national organizations, but also we invited grassroots leaders because we think that that's really important as well. I've seen a lot of work done by national organizations, really great work. However, a lot of that work doesn't always get to the ground. And so we wanted to make sure that we were hearing voices at very high levels, as well as those people that are putting work in on the ground. And then the other way that we collected data was through literature review. So we basically compiled any document that was recognized by the federal government, provincial governments, or that was created by organizations, Indigenous serving organizations, and non-Indigenous organizations. And we gathered them all. And YouthREX, as well as a team of Indigenous youth researchers, read through a lot of these documents. And we actually have a timeline of documents. The very first one would be the Royal Proclamation. And so that was like in the late 1800s. That's how far we could see that Indigenous youth were concerned about their rights and their well-being as far as the Royal Proclamation. And so if you understand Indigenous history and knowledge and Canadian history, the Royal Proclamation actually was an agreement between our peoples long before Canada was actually a country. So that's how long Indigenous youth have been concerned about their rights and have been vocal about their needs. So the other literature that we found, it goes into the Indian Act. There was concerns there, obviously, as well as then into like residential schools. There was many papers that had been created by allies, for example, talking about the severe conditions Indigenous youth were facing at these schools. And then the Royal Proclamation, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, who knows what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is? Okay. Or the RCAP report? Okay. So I'll give you like a short, brief history lesson on the RCAP report. And I hope that after today you go and you seek out these documents that I'm talking to you about. They will really help you understand Indigenous youth today, as well as why things are the way they are today. So the RCAP, okay, who remembers the Oka crisis? Okay, cool. So the Oka crisis, really tense time in Canadian history and Indigenous Canadian relations. After the Oka crisis came to a standoff, the government at the time, the Mulroney government, said that they would create a document. They would look into how this tension was created. And the way they would do that was something called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the RCAP report. So after the Oka crisis, they took commissioners, like really similar to the TRC report. There was commissioners, people were talked to, historians, land protectors, youth, elders, everyone. People were talked to all across the country. And this commission lasted for about 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, they created this federal document that was thousands of pages long. And before they could get into why this tension happened in the Oka crisis, they had to explain like hundreds of years of history, because that's what got us to where we're at today. This was the quickest shelved report in all of Canadian history. There was maybe 100 documents that were ever printed. And then there was a change in government, and it was forgotten. And so that's why a lot of you probably have never heard of it. But a lot of our families put so much work into this Royal Commission. And it's really similar to now we're at the TRC. We're at this reconciliation era. And as Indigenous peoples, like we've seen this before. This isn't our first go of Canadians saying that they want to make a difference, that they want to see change, that they want to support us. So that RCAP report, from there, the young people put a lot of work into the RCAP report, and then you have other reports. The TRC, obviously, a very key report, and then other so I'm a CEO of our youth organization in Ottawa, and we create our own reports as well. And because we know how important reporting is, we know that if I just tell you, you might not believe me. But if I have a document that has some stats in it and some graphs and some really well laid out facts, then you're more likely to believe what I'm saying. So we even do that now. We've learned a lot along the way. All right, so now I'll get into the numbers. Like I just mentioned, numbers are so important. So we spoke to over 500 Indigenous youth across Canada. For anybody that's ever done any research with Indigenous youth, you'll know that this is a very, very high number. Indigenous youth often do not trust researchers for obvious reasons. We've had a really bad experiences with like anthropologists, for example, and things like that. So basically, Indigenous youth have to trust who they're talking to, and they have to trust that something's going to happen with it, or else they won't talk to you. So we heard from 208 Inuit youth, 193 First Nation youth, 55 Métis youth, 5 Inuit/First Nation youth, 5 First Nation/Métis youth, and 1 Métis Inuit youth. We also, I'll show you this map of where all the data came from. So it literally came from coast to coast to coast, and we were really shocked by how many youth wanted to fill out this survey. And if only we had a little bit more time, we think that we could have got even more folks to respond. So this survey lasted for about, I would say, 4 months. So those were our findings within 4 months. So findings. So one thing that's really, really important to me to articulate and acknowledge is that some of our findings did talk about how Indigenous youth feel about reconciliation. And we know that this is like a really big buzzword. But from our findings, I would say over 50% of the Indigenous youth that we spoke with did not believe in reconciliation. For them, they lost hope in it. Some of them didn't even know what it was. Imagine that. 73 of them didn't even know what it was. So I think this is really important to consider as you do this work with Indigenous youth, and for yourselves as well. Reconciliation was never really for Indigenous people. This was for Canadians. Reconciliation was for Canadians, and this was your chance as Canadians to right a wrong. It was not for us to put in our work to make it happen, but we had a little bit of hope, and we wanted to give you guys a chance. But right now, that hope is slowly diminishing and diminishing. So to me, that's very, very sad. And how many times do we have to have a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, a TRC report, and on and on and on? When are things going to start to change? So, again, we have another bar up there that talks about young people's feelings in reconciliation. And then we also have qualitative data about the problems that are happening in community. And a lot of it has to do with mental health, and this is not new, but it's reinforced by the young people a lot of young people are concerned about alcohol and drug abuse. Those are probably their biggest two findings that the youth told us. So, key findings. I'll talk about challenges first. Okay, so challenges. The challenges facing Indigenous communities are wide-ranging and interwoven at the same time. Deeply rooted in intergenerational trauma and colonialism, these challenges include lack of basic needs such as housing and water, mental health and addiction issues, violence, racism, loss of identity and culture, and more. Further, Canada has instated a legal framework that some see as forcing Indigenous nations into conflict and competition with one another, leading to lateral violence. Racism and colonialism, negative attitudes of white settlers, and the lack of recognition of Indigenous people, the history of colonization in residential schools and its effects were emphasized by youth, many of whom perceive this lack of recognition as an unwillingness to learn or care about Indigenous peoples. It is important to understand that social and economic conditions experienced by Indigenous people today is an extension of colonialism, reflected in negative cycles that are identified in this colonial reality. It is further exacerbated by continued inequitable underfunding from the government for Indigenous peoples. So, like I said before, a lot of these discussions and data collection got really dark really fast. But that's our realities. That's our stories. We can't talk about how we feel today without talking about some of these traumas. And we also see a lot of programming that is just solely focused on individuals and their problems. But we need more programs that are trauma-informed. Because if we don't start to deal with these traumas, they're always going to be there. They're never, ever going to get healed. And I use that word healing very, very carefully. Because I don't feel that as an Indigenous person that there's something wrong with me and that I need to be healed. There's a system that needs to be healed, and we always have to remember that there's nothing wrong with us as Indigenous peoples. So the next thing that we found is community strengths, because we can't just always talk about all the dark stuff and the negative stuff. We do also have to focus on our strengths. And one way that I like to think about it is that, there's intergenerational trauma that exists with us, of course, but there's also intergenerational strengths that we all carry as Indigenous people. And I hope that all Indigenous young people focus on their strengths that their ancestors have passed down to them. So the top 3 themes of community strengths that emerged from the survey responses were 1, culture and language. And I would also say this is culture and language for us are not just hobbies or things we do on the side, but this is our well-being. This is our way of living. So it's not separate. And I know that some folks, they do things separately, but ours, they're one in each other. The way we live every day is our culture. The way we understand things is our culture. The way we do things is our also Indigenous philosophies. So the second theme we found was sense of community. And like I mentioned earlier in my personal story, if I didn't find my community in Ottawa, I still feel like I'd be really lost right now. And so that sense of community is so, so important. It allows you to connect with your peers. It allows you to connect with people that are very similar to you, that have been through the same struggles. It allows you to laugh. It allows you to find ceremony. And our third theme of community strengths that we found was resilience and determination. We're very, very strong people. So like right now, I feel really under the weather, but I didn't let it get me down. And I knew that this would be so important to tell you all about this roadmap that we worked on. So, you know, that's like my grandma's resilience, right? You know, she, in my community, my grandma was the rock of our community. She did everything. And so we just do it. Even though we're underfunded and we're doing a lot of this work as volunteers, we know how important the work is. And so we continue to do it because we know it saves lives. So I'm going to have a drink of water. And then so I'll get into reconciliation, 5 key themes. So like I mentioned, in the Indigenous youth that we spoke to, we're really feeling like hope was being lost. However, they did say to us that not all hope was lost. And so what I mean by that is that they said that they still felt that this is how reconciliation could work for them. Number 1, acknowledging the past. Canada has a really bad reputation of not acknowledging the past, not acknowledging our rights. And so I also want you all to think about this, that reconciliation, the reason why that's a buzzword today is because survivors took the government of Canada to court. Canada didn't say, oh yeah, you guys were really treated badly, like let's give you some money back. Like those survivors, the ones that were still alive and remembered the trauma that they went through, took the government of Canada to court. And that court case lasted several years. So a lot of the rights that we carry today that are recognized by the federal government are because we've had to fight tooth and nail to get them. They're not given to us easily. So acknowledging the past, for me, that means that Canada will finally start to acknowledge our inherent rights as we say they are, instead of us constantly taking the government to court. Number 2, healing. So this one, of course, I use it really lightly, that healing, like I said before. But a lot of the young people we spoke to, they felt that, you know, healing was something they needed in their lives, their communities, their families. They need those services. And I'll give you an example right now is that, so through the Indian Act and through how that led into INAC and some of those regulations that exist today, people that are status only have 21 paid mental health service days. So that means that within a whole year, you can only go see a therapist or a psychologist 21 times. But what if I need to go like every week? What if I need to talk to a counselor every week? And I mean, if you look at the traumas that we've been through, that's probably what some people need. Or maybe they need program dollars for ceremonies to happen in their communities. And not to say that ceremonies would be a paid service, but there is resource and funds that need to happen for people and those lodge carriers and those ceremonial holders to, they need a little bit of help to make sure that these programs exist or these ceremonies exist. So healing, improving relations, again, like just going back to number 1 and number 2, treaty and land rights. So this is 100% key. Again, Canada has a really bad reputation of honoring treaties. And also, you know, for a lot of Métis people, a lot of people say that Métis people are landless people. And at the moment, a lot of Métis people, they have to fight every time they want to use their homeland, their land in their homelands. Access to these lands was almost forgotten and eradicated by the federal government as a way to erase us as a people. I do come from Métis settlements, and so we are land-based people, but again, we had to fight for every square meter of land that we are protectors of today. And then lastly, equity. So I'll give you an example of the work that I do in Ottawa. So we run a nonprofit organization, a youth-led, youth-driven organization, and we have no dollars to do this. Most of us do this work as volunteers. However, the work that we're doing is that healing work that should be funded. On a weekly basis, we're probably doing like 10 interventions a week. And we don't get paid to do those things. So where's the equity? You know, why are we still having to find ways to heal ourselves, even though people are always talking about reconciliation? It's like mind-boggling. So where am I at? So I got a few more quotes for you. As always, these quotes are so personal. All right, so this one was a survey respondent, and they said to us, "I am not surrounded by reconciliation. It is something I would like to feel in the community. Every day, it is a struggle to believe that we have come to a point of understanding because nobody truly shows how resilient they have been to say we are reconciled." Another survey respondent told us, "Reconciliation is about creating shared space in Canada. We can create a country that is as inclusive as diverse and as safe as the rest of the world seems to think it is." A lot of these young people I feel like they're poets. This young person said, "The day that I can see Indigenous youth achieve the standard of living and the quality of life that is enjoyed by the rest of the Canadian society and its youth is when I believe reconciliation has been achieved." So from all of this information that was provided to us, we did create requirements for the federal government to begin the process of responding to TRC Call to Action 66. So what's TRC 66? Yeah, multi-year youth funding for grassroots programs on reconciliation. And there's another part too. Does anybody remember? Yeah, who saw that? Oh, all the way back there? Best practices, yeah. So best practices and a network of shared best practices. So one of the requirements we told them to begin this process was, one, Indigenous Youth Voices is established as a national nonprofit. And the reason why we said that is because obviously a couple of months was not enough time to do the work that we really needed. It was enough time to collect these responses. However, it wasn't enough time to create a strategy. And so there were several points of the work that we wanted to continue. We wanted to continue to see more research led by Indigenous youth for Indigenous youth, because we have a different way of hearing our stories and understanding our stories than sometimes non-Indigenous people do. Sometimes non-Indigenous people just want to see the numbers, right? And we're more of like a qualitative kind of people, not so much quantitative. That was one thing that we wanted to continue. We also acknowledged that right now, if there was a fund that could respond to TRC Call to Action 66, there wouldn't really be that many people that could accept these funds. And for us, it was really important that whoever is accepting these funds would be youth-led organizations. And so there has to be a time of capacity development in order to create youth-led organizations that could accept dollars, or at least find some kind of way to work around funds. Like, I know that some youth today and the organizations across the country, what they do is they work with organizational mentors or charities. But again, it has to be something that more capacity was around. So another requirement was Reconciliation and Indigenous Youth Voices Network. So this network, in a way, it is already established. Our networks are very vast. The youth that we worked with, their networks are very vast. For this one, it's really just a matter of finding a platform that's accessible and easy to use. So that was another requirement. And then the last requirement was reconciliation and program areas, multi-year funding for Indigenous youth. And so this is also a part that the Government of Canada has to work closely with Indigenous youth on, because this means that the Government of Canada has to create a fund. And so they got to do some costing out and more research and things like that. So I'll read you some quotes again. It is my hope for TRC 66 that TRC 66 is implemented so communities can support Indigenous youth in achieving their desired levels of self-determination rooted in the types of programs they desire, whether it is language training, a safe place to hang out, cultural knowledge hubs, or community gatherings. I wish for these programs to be sustainable and long-lasting in a legacy way for people at the community level. Another quote. All the answers and solutions are there, many of which are at the mouths and hands of youth. It's whether or not those are actually implemented. Also, basic human rights, there is no reconciliation or moving forward or full Indigenous youth empowerment without meeting the basic human rights like water, food, shelter, and safety. So I think this is one of the quotes that will close off the requirements section. I believe healing our communities is an incredible, important aspect of reconciliation and ensuring youth have the cultural confidence to carry the stories of our elders and ancestors forward. So the big question is, now that all of that work has been done, what are the next steps? And right now, there has been no commitment by the federal government to continue this work. I think that the federal government is having a hard time grasping the idea that Indigenous youth aren't fully under the buzzword of reconciliation. So I think that, again, we're in a situation where political motive and the willingness to do the right thing has come to a head. I really hope that this changes. I've heard politicians say things like, oh, well, I can't give you these program dollars or do that for you because it's going to hurt the 2019 election. And like, how does that make sense? That you're willing to just disregard the livelihoods of Indigenous youth so that you can win the next election. And again, just like carry on and not do anything for us. That's kind of where we're at right now as next steps. We have brought together a group of really amazing Indigenous youth leaders that will be the ones pushing this forward. And whether we get commitment by the federal government or not, we will continue to push this, and we will continue to shed light on areas that are disservicing our youth. So I have a few more quotes to close off this part. I hope these youth submissions are valued. It feels like these surveys just get lost in the date, and youth are constantly asked to fill out papers after paper. Things don't change after that. I hope we get to see the action items from our invaluable contributions to this project. And so that's why no matter what the federal response, we have to keep pushing forward. These young people trusted us with their stories. Another young person told us at the national gathering, "I'm afraid of people feeling defeated. I'm afraid of people losing hope. We must hold each other together. We need to understand that we are all different in places of healing. I want people to feel fired up. We can no longer accept the minimum." And the very last quote that I'll share with you is, I think that it is very important to reconcile, not only with the government and the rest of Canada, but also with ourselves, our communities, and our families. And so the last thing that I want to share with you before I close off this talk is that, even if we don't really believe in this idea of reconciliation anymore, we're still doing work on the ground. We're still finding each other. We're still building each other up. We're still in a time of resurgence. And I really believe that our organization in Ottawa is an example of this. So our organization is called Assembly of 7 Generations, or A7G. And we kind of were born out of the Idle No More movement, as was a lot of sparks of young people. And so, if the government honored the TRC 66, I think this is what you could see more of. So that's our new logo, which we're so proud of. It was designed by Migize. He's a local Toronto artist. And his mushroom is actually one of the keepers of the prophecy of the 7 generations. And so it's really fitting that he created this logo for us. You'll see the seven people there, the 7 prophets, but you'll also see community. You'll see it's like those young people coming together in the lodge. And then on the sides, you see those trees. And so sometimes we forget about the natural world when we start talking about policies and, reports and data. But it's really the natural world that holds us down, that gives us guidance. And so those trees are so important because they're like our pillars. And they're so deeply rooted into the ground. And that's like us as Indigenous peoples. You could chop those trees down, but another tree will come back up because of how deep our roots go. So this is like pictures of our Friday night drop-ins. We hold weekly drop-ins every Friday, 5:30, and we do weekly selfies. So weekly selfies are actually a data collection tool in a way. So if you look at the people in the weekly selfies, it actually helps us keep track of participant numbers. So instead of having like a clipboard that says like fill out this and this is how we know people are coming out. And again, we have an organization back home that offers us free space, no strings attached, every Friday. And there's no like youth coordinator. It's not like a program. We just come together, and so we're all the keepers of this service, if that makes sense. All right, so I just have a bunch of pictures, pictures are really fun. So this is a picture of our Elders and Youth Gathering. This is our second annual Elders and Youth Gathering that just happened. We camped out on the land for just one night, but we were there for 2 days. It was a lot of work. Again, we did this on like a budget of like $5,000, and there was 50 young people that came out. So I don't know if any of you are like also event coordinators or program officers, but $5,000 is like just like penny pinching. Again, this is like our first annual Elders and Youth Gathering. That's some of the elders that came out to support us that year, and it was in this big park in Ottawa. This was last year. We had a love conference. So it was Lateral Love conference. So at the conference, we talked about what lateral love means to us, and how we can kind of combat lateral violence. And so again, like ceremony was really important to us. And then after we had the conference, we had a really amazing round dance. So this is the Pride March this year. And a lot of the young people that we work with are Two-Spirit or part of the LGBTQ community. And it's really important for us to support young people no matter how they identify or no matter how they live their lives. And I wasn't there, unfortunately. I wish I was, but I heard some really amazing stories. So like at our Friday night youth gatherings, we share songs a lot. So we'll end the night by sharing songs. And so I heard that at this march, the young people that were there just took out their drums and like started leading some songs, and kept the momentum of the march going, which is a really huge burden to carry, but really amazing stuff. So this is our Elders and Youth Gathering. Like I said, we're out on the land, and young people are actually learning how to build their own infrastructures. And as Indigenous people, our infrastructures are very, very technologically advanced. So our infrastructures actually go back to the land eventually. So that concept of like recycling and compost, we've been using those concepts long before they even existed. And so even right down to our infrastructures. So this was that round dance I was talking about last year. We're gonna do another round dance this year. Again, like our budget's only like $5,000. We do big things with very little money, but again, it's not fair that we always have to be doing that. But we still make it happen. This is a picture of Reach Up North. This was like one of our first programs. It was like a 31 module kind of program. So back then we didn't really, we were still doing programs, like that kind of like conservative way we all think of programming. And it was cool, but there was a lot of lessons learned. And one of them is that like confining programs don't really work for our youth. And so they have to be very open and fluid, and you really have to time it out very strategically as well. And you always have to have food. And so that's all the slides I have.
Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. And you can follow us at A7G_official on Instagram and Twitter. And what's our Facebook?
I think it's just A7G Assembly of 7 Generations.
Yeah, so on Facebook it's just like, you can find us as like Assembly of 7 Generations. So yeah, follow us. And for IYV, we have our website. It's just indigenousYouthVoices.ca. And yeah, so that's the work that I'm doing. So thanks so much for having me. Miigwech, hi hi.